My fiancée left me after I did this at my bachelor party trip. 5 years ago, I had everything a man could want. A thriving career, a beautiful fiancée, and a future so bright I thought nothing could ruin it. I was 28 years old and living the dream. My name is Walt, and this is the story of how a single decision destroyed everything I had, and how I clawed my way back from the dead. At the time, I was an architect, still relatively new at my firm but making great progress. I designed subdivisions, not the most glamorous work, but I enjoyed it. More importantly, I was engaged to the love of my life, Emily. We had been together for 3 years when I proposed, and she said yes without hesitation. We had always known we didn't want a big, flashy wedding. Instead, we planned to elope in San Diego, turning our wedding into a honeymoon getaway. No stress, no planning chaos, just us, standing on a beach, making promises for a lifetime. Everything was perfect, until I took that trip. Since our elopement was going to be simple and relatively inexpensive, we decided to splurge on pre-wedding activities. Instead of traditional bachelor and bachelorette parties, we would cross off a bucket list item, something we had always dreamed of doing. For Emily, that meant swimming with sharks. She and her best friend Maggie flew to Florida for a long weekend, where they did one of those cage diving excursions. For me, it was something much bigger. I had always been obsessed with Thailand. Ever since I was a kid, I had dreamed of visiting the country. It was one of those random childhood fascinations that never faded, and Emily encouraged me to go. "You literally mentioned Thailand on our first date," she reminded me. "You have to go." So, 6 months into our engagement, I booked the trip. My best friend Jorge came with me, and we spent the first 3 days living it up. Beaches, temples, bars, everything I had dreamed of. And then, on the 4th day, everything fell apart. That night, Jorge got completely wasted. I had been pacing myself because the next morning, we had planned to go on a jungle excursion, something I had been looking forward to for years. But when morning came, Jorge was too hungover to move. "Just go tomorrow, man," he groaned from the hotel bed. But I wasn't about to miss out. So, I left without him. Walking through town, I spotted a local guy offering a jungle tour. He had a Jeep, a laminated sign, and he spoke perfect English. "Best jungle tour in Thailand," he promised, grinning ear to ear. "Half price if you book right now." I hesitated. Something about it felt off. But the guy seemed legit, and I was feeling adventurous. So I got in the Jeep. That was the biggest mistake of my life. At first, everything was fine. We drove through off-road trails, deep into the jungle. It was rough terrain, but I was loving it. Then, we pulled into a small clearing, and suddenly, oncoming police car 2 police trucks pulled up. Before I could even process what was happening, 4 officers jumped out, shouting in a language I didn't understand. They yanked the driver out of the Jeep and started searching the vehicle. I had no idea what was going on. Then, one of the officers reached under the seat and pulled out a large bag of white powder. My stomach dropped. I didn't need a translator to know exactly what it was. Meth. I started panicking. "I don't know anything about that," I tried to say, raising my hands. "I just paid for a tour." But they weren't listening. One of the officers pointed at me, barked something in broken English. No ID, no passport. And that's when it hit me. My passport was back in my hotel room. I had nothing on me to prove who I was. Then, the worst realization of all, I wasn't in Thailand anymore. I was in Cambodia. They took me to a small police station in the middle of nowhere. No calls, no explanations, no way to reach the outside world. I kept thinking, Jorge will realize I'm gone. He'll come looking for me. But days passed, then weeks, and it became clear. Nobody was coming. I had been swallowed whole by a foreign prison, and my worst fear came crashing down on me. My family thinks I'm dead. My fiancé, my parents, my friends, they all believe I disappeared in Thailand. I had no way to tell them I was alive, and I had no idea if I would ever make it home again. I won't go into every detail of what those 52 months were like, but hell is an easy comparison. I spent 5 months in a holding cell before I even saw a judge. There was no translator, so my case got postponed another 5 months. 14 months later, the judge dismissed my charges, but the prosecutor appealed. I spent another 28 months in custody. I lost 4.5 years of my life. And during all that time, I thought about one thing. Emily. I held on to the hope that when I finally got out, she would be waiting for me, that she hadn't moved on, that we could pick up where we left off, that my life wasn't completely ruined. But when I finally got released and called home, everything I had clung to for survival came crashing down. Emily was engaged to another man. And worse, I had a 4-year-old son I had never met. When I first got arrested, I still had hope. I kept thinking, Jorge will notice I'm missing. He'll get the police involved. Someone will come looking for me. But as days turned into weeks, that hope slowly faded. And as weeks turned into months, I came to a devastating realization. Everyone thinks I'm dead. The first 5 months of my imprisonment were spent in a small, overcrowded holding cell. I wasn't given a single phone call. I wasn't allowed to contact the embassy. I wasn't even told exactly what I was being charged with, only that I was accused of drug-related crimes. For the first few weeks, I kept demanding to see someone, anyone, who spoke fluent English. But I was ignored. At first, I thought it was just incompetence. But then I realized the truth. They didn't want to help me, because to them, I was just another faceless foreigner caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. It took 5 months before I was taken to a courthouse. I thought this was it, the moment I could finally explain myself. But when I got there was no translator, no lawyer, no one to even tell me what was happening. I sat in a chair, completely clueless, while a group of officials spoke rapidly in a language I didn't understand. Then, without warning, they postponed my case for another 5 months. I had spent 5 months in a cell, only to be sent right back with no answers. That's when the reality of my situation really started to sink in. Nobody was coming, and I had no way out. I won't give you the full details of what those years were like, but I will say this. A Cambodian prison is not designed for survival. There were days without food. There were days without clean water. There were days where I thought I wouldn't wake up the next morning. The prison was overcrowded, with dozens of men crammed into cells meant for 5 people. I had to learn how to fight just to hold on to my place on the floor. And then there were the guards. Let's just say, they weren't friendly. Some were corrupt, and if you had money, you could bribe your way to better conditions. But I had nothing. No family sending me money. No embassy visits. No way to even tell the outside world that I was still alive. So I suffered, alone, for 4.5 years. When my actual hearing finally came, I thought there was a chance I'd get out. The judge dismissed my charges, ruling that there was no evidence against me. I was free, or so I thought, because the prosecutor immediately appealed the dismissal, and I was thrown right back into my cell. I lost another 28 months waiting for that appeal to be processed. The worst moment of my life was sitting in that courtroom, thinking I was about to be freed, only to be shoved back into my nightmare for 2 more years. That was the moment I truly started losing hope. I survived the first year in that prison because I still had hope. The second year, hope started fading. By the 3rd year, I was just going through the motions, eating when I could, drinking filthy water, sleeping in shifts so I wouldn't get robbed or attacked. By the 4th year, I was ready to die. There were days I wished one of the other inmates would just end it for me. There were nights I hoped I wouldn't wake up, because what was I holding on to? I had no idea if my family still remembered me. Emily? She had probably moved on. For all I knew, she had already married someone else. And even if she hadn't, would she even want me anymore after all this time? I was nothing like the man she fell in love with. I was broken. But then, after 52 months, a guard came into my cell and said the one thing I thought I'd never hear. You're free to go. I was dumped onto the streets of Cambodia with nothing but the clothes on my back. I had no passport, no money, no phone. I wasn't even supposed to be in this country in the first place. The only thing I could think to do was find the U.S. Embassy. When I got there, they pulled up my file and immediately found a missing persons report with my name on it. They let me call home. My hands were shaking as I dialed the number. Ring, ring, then, hello? I recognized my mother's voice instantly. She sounded older, more tired, like life had worn her down. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Tears filled my eyes. I tried again. Mom, it's me. Silence. Then, a sharp gasp. Walt? Oh my God. Oh my God. Walt, where are you? I broke down sobbing right there in the embassy office. Because for the first time in 4.5 years, I was finally talking to someone who loved me. She called for my father, and when he picked up the phone, his voice cracked with emotion. Son, we thought you were gone. I know, Dad, I whispered. I know. I told them everything. The arrest, the trial, the years spent locked away with no contact with the outside world. And then, finally, I asked the question that had haunted me for years. What about Emily? There was a long pause. Then my mother said the words that made my heart shatter all over again. Sweetheart, she's engaged. I had spent 52 months in prison, holding on to one hope, that when I finally got out, Emily would still be waiting for me, that she would still love me, that somehow I could rebuild what I lost. But when my mother said the words, she's engaged, it felt like I had been punched in the chest. Everything went numb. I barely processed the rest of the conversation. My mother was frantic, telling me how they had searched for me, how they had spent years trying to find out what happened. They had flown to Thailand. They had contacted the embassy multiple times. They had filed a missing persons report and kept pushing for answers. But nobody had thought to look in Cambodia. For them, I had vanished, gone without a trace. After 2 years, they held a memorial service for me. They thought I had been kidnapped, maybe by cartels, maybe by human traffickers. But either way, they had given up hope that I was still alive. And Emily? She had been pregnant with my child the whole time. The words hit me like a freight train. Emily was pregnant? I repeated, barely able to get the words out. My mother let out a shaky breath. Yes, she found out after you left for Thailand. I could barely breathe. Where is he? With Emily. His name is Paul. I closed my eyes, trying to process it all. I had a son, a child who had been born while I was rotting in a Cambodian prison, a boy who had grown up without ever knowing his real father. And now, he called another man Dad. By the time I made it back to the U.S., I was mentally and emotionally drained. I had spent the last 5 years living in survival mode, and now, I was supposed to just return to normal life? My parents were overjoyed to have me back, but they were also hiding something. I could see it in the way they avoided eye contact, in the way my mother kept saying, "We'll talk about everything once you're settled." Finally, I pushed them. Just tell me the truth about Emily. They sat me down at the kitchen table. My mother reached into a drawer and pulled out a save-the-date card. My hands shook as I took it. On the front was a photo of Emily, smiling, glowing, looking every bit as beautiful as I remembered. Next to her stood a tall, handsome guy I had never seen before. Her fiancé. The wedding was in 6 months. I couldn't breathe. I had known she had moved on, but seeing it in front of me made it real. I forced myself to ask, "How close are you with her now?" My mother hesitated. Very. That's when my father spoke up. Her dad passed away last year, and I agreed to walk her down the aisle. I felt like the wind had been knocked out of me. My own father was giving her away. I shouldn't have been angry. I shouldn't have felt betrayed. But I did. I was supposed to be the one standing at that altar. I was supposed to be the one building a family with her. And instead, she had buried me and moved on. I clenched my jaw, forcing back the emotions threatening to spill over. What else aren't you telling me? My mother exchanged a look with my father. Then she picked up her tablet, scrolled for a moment, and handed it to me. I looked down at the screen. It was a group photo. My parents, Emily, her fiancé, Emily's mom, my brother, my sister, Jorge, and in the center, a little boy sitting behind a birthday cake. The decorations read, "Happy 4th birthday, Paul." I stared at the image, my hands trembling. That was my son, smiling, happy, surrounded by a family that no longer included me. My mother's voice was soft. "That's Paul. Paul Walter Rhine." She gave him my name. I felt everything hit me at once. The years I had lost. The family that had moved on without me. The fiancé I would never get back. I barely heard my mother when she whispered, "I'm so sorry, sweetheart." I wasn't angry at her. I wasn't even angry at Emily. I was just empty, because everything I had held on to for survival in that prison had just been ripped away. I tried calling Emily that night. It rang, and rang, and rang, until finally someone answered. But it wasn't Emily. It was a man's voice. Hello? I froze. Is Emily there? The man hesitated. Who is this? It's Walt. Silence. Then, in a flat tone, the man said, She can't talk right now. Then he hung up. I sat there, staring at the phone, my heart pounding in my ears. That was him, her fiancé. Emily hadn't changed her number, but she had moved on so completely that the man sleeping next to her didn't even recognize my name. And I finally understood. I was a ghost in my own life. For days after that phone call, I couldn't shake the hollow emptiness inside me. I had been locked away for years, dreaming about the life I would come back to, only to find that it didn't exist anymore. Emily had moved on. My parents had grieved and rebuilt. My son didn't even know me. And now, I had to figure out how to exist in a life that no longer had a place for me. A week after my return, my parents arranged for me to finally meet Paul. It would be at the park, a neutral space, where he could play, and I could ease into his life without overwhelming him. But as I stood there waiting, my stomach was in knots. Then I saw their car pull up, and only two people got out, Paul and Kevin. Emily wasn't there. I swallowed hard, my eyes locking onto my son, this little boy with my name, my blood, my DNA, who had no idea who I really was. He ran up to my dad first, hugging him. Then, when he noticed me, he hesitated and retreated toward Kevin. I felt a sharp sting in my chest. I knew it wasn't his fault. He was just a kid. But that hesitation, that instinct to go to Kevin for safety, it crushed me. Kevin walked over and extended his hand. Sorry, Emily couldn't make it. She tried, but she's just not ready yet. I nodded, shaking his hand. I understand. And I did. But that didn't make it hurt any less. After that, Paul ran off toward the playground, and I watched him go, feeling like a stranger in my own son's life. My mother nudged me. Go play with him. So, I did. Turns out, Paul was obsessed with superheroes. He wanted to be Spider-Man, which meant I had to be Rhino. So I chased him around the playground, pretending to be a bad guy. I let him trap me in a web, dramatically stumbling and falling to the ground. And for the first time since coming home, I heard his laugh. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. For a brief moment, I thought, maybe this won't be so hard. Maybe I could find my place in his life. Then, as we sat down to eat, he turned to Kevin and said, Dad, can we get a cookie cake on the way home? And just like that, the illusion shattered. I knew. Of course I knew. Kevin had been there for years. Kevin had held him when he cried. Kevin had tucked him in at night. Kevin had been the only father he had ever known. And yet, hearing my son call him Dad felt like a knife to the heart. I forced a smile, muttered something about needing to use the bathroom, and walked away before anyone could see the tears in my eyes. When I came back, Kevin was waiting for me. I didn't want to talk, but he did. Can we talk for a second? He asked. I sighed. Yeah, man. What's on your mind? He hesitated, then said, Look, I'm sorry for what happened to you. It's a bad deal all around, but I wanted to talk because I'm worried about Emily and Paul. I clenched my jaw. Of course, he was worried about Emily. Kevin continued. Emily hasn't been herself. She took a long time to move on after you disappeared. She cried the first time we kissed because it was different. I felt my fists tighten. I want you to have a relationship with your son, he went on. But I also need you to understand that Emily and we built a life together. And I don't want anything disrupting that. I made an appointment for her to see a counselor. I'd appreciate it if you could respect that and not reach out to her until she's ready. I stared at him. I wanted to hate him. I wanted to blame him. But the truth? He wasn't a bad guy. He was just a man who had fallen in love with a grieving woman. So, I swallowed my pride and said, Yeah, man, I can do that. Then I turned and walked away, because I needed to be alone. A few weeks later, Emily and I finally met up. We chose a neutral place, an Applebee's. I don't know why, but it felt safer than anywhere we had once called ours. When she walked in, I felt like I had been punched in the gut. She looked the same, still beautiful, Still Emily. When we hugged, my entire body shivered. We started with small talk, but eventually, we couldn't avoid it anymore. She told me about the grief, the memorial service, the years she spent thinking I was dead. She told me about how she never wanted to move on, but after years of being alone, she finally let Kevin in. Then I said the words I had been holding inside for weeks. I still love you. She started crying, and then she shook her head. I love you too, she whispered, but I love Kevin too, and I'm marrying him. It was over. The final nail in the coffin. Emily was gone, and nothing was bringing her back. We talked about Paul, about what our dynamic would be going forward. She promised that he would always know who I was, that I would never be erased from his life. That meant everything to me. But when she said that Kevin had planned to adopt him after the wedding, that broke me. He's my son, I said quietly. Emily nodded. I know. That's why Kevin won't be adopting him anymore. For the first time, I felt like I had won something. Not my relationship, not my old life, but at least my son would always be mine. The pain of losing Emily never went away, but I refused to let it define me. I started focusing on Paul, building a relationship, even if I wasn't the only father figure in his life. And when Kevin offered me a job lead through his brother, I took it, because if I was going to be part of Paul's life, I needed to stand on my own 2 feet again. I thought accepting my new reality would get easier with time, that if I just focused on Paul, if I threw myself into building a new life, the pain of losing Emily would fade away. But every time I saw her, every time we met for Paul's sake, I felt that same ache in my chest. I still loved her, and I hated myself for it. Over the next few months, I spent more and more time with my son. At first, he was hesitant around me, but little by little, he warmed up. We played superheroes at the park. We got ice cream together on weekends. He started calling me Rhino, because I always played the bad guy when we wrestled. I cherished every moment. But the hardest part? Hearing him still call Kevin Dad. It happened all the time. At dinner, at the park, when he wanted something. I knew it wasn't Paul's fault. Kevin had been there for him since he was a baby. But every time I heard that word, it felt like a knife to the gut. And I started to wonder, would I ever be more than just a fun uncle to my own son? One day, when Kevin came to pick up Paul, he asked if we could talk. At first, I assumed it was another boundary conversation. Another reminder to respect Emily's space, to not push too hard. But instead, he had a job lead for me. Kevin's brother owned a construction company and needed an estimator. I know you were an architect before everything, Kevin said. My brother could use someone like you. I felt conflicted. I didn't want to owe Kevin anything, but I also needed to start rebuilding my career. So, I swallowed my pride and said, yeah, I'll take the interview. And just like that, I had my first real job since coming home. It wasn't architecture, but it was a start. A step toward getting my life back on track. As much as I was growing closer to Paul, I was still losing Emily for good. Her wedding was 6 months away, and the plans were moving forward without a hitch. There was only one change. My father had been removed from his role of walking her down the aisle. She had decided to ask her older brother instead. My parents didn't argue. They understood. It would have been too much, too painful, to have my own father giving her away to another man. But that didn't make it any easier to accept. I tried to ignore it, to pretend it didn't bother me. But deep down, I still felt like I was watching someone else live my life. The weekend before the wedding, Emily and Kevin had their bachelor/bachelorette parties. They weren't doing anything wild, just a dinner with friends, some casual fun, and then meeting up at a bar later that night. I wasn't part of it. I wasn't even supposed to see them that night. But after everything I had been through, I didn't want to spend the night alone in my apartment, drinking myself into a pit of self-pity. So, I went out, and by pure coincidence, I ended up at the same bar as Emily's group. At first, I tried to hide in the crowd, not wanting to ruin her night. But she spotted me immediately. She walked over, her face lighting up. Walt, what are you doing here? Before I could answer, she grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the dance floor. Come on, dance with me. We danced. We laughed. We drank. And then, as a slow song started playing, she stumbled into me. For a moment, We just stood there, our faces inches apart, our lips so close. I could feel her breath on my skin. I could see the conflict in her eyes. And for the first time since coming home, I felt like maybe, just maybe, she still wanted me too. But then, she pulled away, and the moment was gone. We both laughed it off, pretending it was nothing. But deep down, I think we both knew. It was everything. I woke up the next morning, nursing a hangover and a heavy heart. I had spent the whole night thinking about that almost kiss, wondering if it meant something, if Emily was having second thoughts. Then, around midday, someone started banging on my door. I opened it to find Emily standing there, tears in her eyes. Before I could even ask what was wrong, she threw her arms around me and kissed me, really kissed me. For the first time in 5 years, I felt her lips on mine, and I swear, it felt like coming home. When we finally pulled apart, I whispered, "Emily, what's going on?" She took a deep breath, wiping her eyes. I ended it. My heart stopped. "You what?" She nodded, sniffing back tears. "I told Kevin I still love you, and I can't marry someone else when you're back." I felt like I couldn't breathe. For months, I had been torturing myself, thinking I had lost her forever. But now, she was standing in front of me, choosing me all over again. "I want you, Walt." And for the first time since coming home, I finally felt like I had a reason to stay. For 5 years, I had dreamed of this exact moment. Emily standing in front of me, telling me she still loved me, that she still wanted us. And yet, as I stood there, my heart racing, a part of me couldn't believe it was real. You ended it?" I asked again, needing to hear it one more time. Emily nodded. "I told Kevin this morning. He deserves someone who loves him the way he loves me. And that's not me." I didn't know what to say. I had spent so long convincing myself that I had lost her forever. And now, here she was, giving me everything I had been hoping for. I did the only thing that felt right. I pulled her into my arms and kissed her again. Because for the first time since coming home, I wasn't lost anymore. The next day, my father went to visit Kevin. I had expected anger, maybe even resentment. But my father told me that Kevin had been surprisingly calm. He was hurt, of course, my dad said, but I think he always knew this was a possibility. Kevin had seen the way Emily looked at me. He had felt the shift in their relationship the moment I returned. And as much as it hurt him, he wasn't the kind of man to fight for someone who didn't truly love him. He took a step back with dignity, and in the end, he proved to be a better man than I ever gave him credit for. Of course, nothing in life comes without consequences. A few days later, Kevin's brother called me into his office. He sat me down, his expression tight. "Look, Walt," he said, "I'm not going to make a big deal out of this, but my family needs time to heal, and I think it's best if we part ways." I had expected this, and honestly, I couldn't blame him. "I understand," I said, but before I left, he handed me a business card. "Call this guy. His name's Lee. He runs a commercial construction company, and he's looking for an estimator. I told him about you, and he's willing to give you a shot." I stared at him, caught off guard. "You're helping me get another job?" Kevin's brother sighed. "This isn't for you. It's for my brother." I nodded, taking the card. I wasn't about to waste the opportunity. With Kevin out of the picture, there was only one question left. Were Emily and I going to pick up where we left off? We had spent years planning a beach wedding, and now we had a fully booked venue, an officiant, and guests already invited. For a wedding that was supposed to be Kevin's. It felt wrong, but at the same time, it felt right. My father made the decision for us. "Why waste the reservations?" he said. "You love each other. Just do it." So we did. 6 months after coming home, Emily and I finally said, "I do." It wasn't the wedding we originally planned, but it was perfect. Jorge was my best man. My father walked Emily down the aisle. Paul stood beside us as we made our vows to each other. And as I looked at the woman I had loved for so many years, I realized something. I had spent so long grieving everything I had lost. But the truth was, I had found so much more. It's been a month since our wedding. Paul is adjusting to having me in his life full-time. He still calls Kevin sometimes, but he also calls me Dad now. And every time he says it, I feel like I've won the lottery. I got the job with Lee's company, and I'm slowly working my way back into architecture. Emily and I are stronger than ever, and for the first time in years, I wake up without feeling like I'm missing something, because I finally have everything I ever wanted. I went to hell and back. I was wrongfully imprisoned. I was forgotten by the world. I lost 5 years of my life, but in the end, I got a second chance, and this time, I won't let it slip away.